I normally come to Moscow to present the Statistical Review in July. I was very keen to come to Moscow in July. I was all ready to come. I even brought a New England football shirt all ready to come to come in July. But I was told, no, Spencer, people will be far too busy to listen to statistics in July. And so I was told I had to watch the World Cup at home, and I wasn't allowed here until September. So I'm pleased to be here, but I would have wished even more to have been here in July. As Natalia was saying, BP has produced the Statistical Review of World Energy for the last 67 years. And I think it's fair to say that it is viewed around the world as the key reference source for energy data around the world. As Natalia said, statistics can mean many things. We will all disagree on how to interpret those data. We will disagree about what they imply for the future. But at least we can all start by agreeing about what happened last year, and at least we can all start from that same position. The main purpose, of the launching of the Statistical Review is to tell everyone the new data are available. They're available for you to download, to think about, and to start your own analysis. For people of a certain age with grey hair like me, you may well want to take home a hard copy of the statistics, and they're in the background. For the younger people in the audience, you don't have to take home a hard copy. You can go on to bb.com. All the data are available on the website. You can download them onto your Excel spreadsheets, and you can start analysing the data away. So to one level, that's the main job done. It's telling you the data are available. You should all go away and do your own analysis and understand what you make of them. The trouble is that often makes for quite a short presentation. So rather than just saying that, we also take the opportunity of the Statistical Review to just stand back a little bit and say, what did go on last year? How should I interpret what went on last year? Many of us work in the energy industry, and so we live through it. But it's hard to often understand exactly what's going on when you're actually right in the thick of it. And so we use the Statistical Review as an opportunity to stand back and tell some stories and better understand what went on last year, and more importantly, what that may tell us about how energy markets may evolve going forward. At first blush, the headline statistics for last year look quite disappointing in the context of the transition to a lower carbon energy system. Gains in energy efficiency slowed last year. Global coal consumption increased after 3 consecutive years of substantial falls. And carbon emissions from energy use rose by over 1.5% after 3 years in which they hadn't essentially risen at all. So the natural instinct is here, what's happening? This big progress we had been making seems to have come to a pause. Should we be worried? Is this a change in direction? Oh, I'm not sure, I should have gone back. Is this a change in direction? And I think the answer is not really. I think some of you who would have been here a year ago when I spoke about the Statistical Review may have remembered me saying that some of the amazing progress that we've seen in 2014, 15 and 16 reflected structural factors, long-term structural factors, which would persist going forward. And sure enough, they did persist going forward this time. And as you'll come on to see me explain, we saw very significant amounts of switching away from coal into natural gas in some countries. Renewable energy continued to grow very strongly. So some of those structural factors persist. But some of the factors leading to the progress we had seen through 2014, 15, 16 were cyclical factors which were likely to unwind. The pace of economic growth was relatively slow. Much of that weakness was in the industrial sector, which tends to be very energy intensive. As those cyclical factors unwound, we always knew that we were going to have some partial reversal, and that's what we saw last year. So the way I think about 2017, as the title says, energy in 2017 was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We are still on this progress and this transition to a lower carbon energy system, but the pace of that progress was a little bit slower last year than we've seen in the past, reflecting sort of some of those cyclical factors unwinding. So if we start, first of all, just with the headline numbers, overall energy demand grew by about 2.2% last year. That's up from 1.2% the year before, so strong growth in energy demand. In terms of what led to that particularly strong growth, it was growth within the OECD, within the developed world, which really drove the pickup in energy growth last year. Now, much of that related to the fact that we saw stronger economic growth, stronger GDP growth last year. And so that, to that extent, that's a good news story. Developed economies were growing more quickly, and they needed more energy to fuel that growth. But we also saw slightly slower growth in energy productivity as well. And that largely reflects, or energy efficiency, slower gains in energy efficiency, if you like. And that reflects, in large part, the composition of that growth. Not only was the developed economies growing more quickly, much of that growth was concentrated within the industrial sector, and it's the industrial sector which is more energy intensive, and so it needed particular strong amounts of energy to grow. Although the unusual growth was in the developed world, the overall growth continued to be dominated by the developing economies, which accounted for over 80% of the growth in energy demand in 2017, with Chinese economy accounting for around a third of that growth. So continuing strong growth in Chinese energy demand, and it dominating, being the world's largest growing market for energy again. This strong growth in global energy demand was reflected in pretty strong growth across the fuels last year. Natural gas, shown here in red, was the single largest source of energy growth last year. As I'll come on to explain, 2017 was a bumpy year for natural gas, particularly led by developments in China. And I think the developments in China are really quite fascinating, and I'll come back to those issues in a moment. That was also closely followed by strong growth in both renewable energy, shown here in orange, and in oil demand, where we saw another year of strong growth in oil demand. The step back, if you like, is particularly pronounced here in the sense, as I suggested, global coal consumption increased in 2017 after falling sharply in 2016 and indeed in 2015 and 2014. So a turnaround in global coal consumption. In terms of geographies, that was largely driven by strong growth in India, but we also saw an increase in coal consumption within China as well. And I'll come on and talk a little bit about how to interpret those movements. This is a story for the global energy system, just briefly to put that into the context of what happened here in Russia. Russian energy demand grew pretty strongly in 2017, up by 1.5%. That was weaker growth than had been seen in the previous year in 2016, but still exceptionally strong growth relative to what had been seen on average over the last 10 years. Much of this growth had been motivated, was driven by the particular cold winter last year, and the nature of where that cold winter, where the particular pronounced weakness was, meant that we saw particularly strong growth as well as in gas, but also in coal, also affected by the fact that we saw almost or a slight decline in hydropower last year due to the relatively low rainfalls. So that's the story that we saw in Russia in 2017. That's a very quick overview in terms of the data from sort of 10,000 feet. The plan now is to look at some of the energy markets in a little bit more detail, starting first with the oil market. A key defining feature of the oil market over the last few years has been the strong growth in oil demand, and that continued last year. Oil demand, as you can see in this chart here, grew by about 1.7 million barrels a day in 2017. And that's similar to the 1.6 million barrels a day seen in 2016, and even stronger growth seen in 2015. For those of you who don't carry these statistics around in your head, average growth that we've become used to for oil demand is around 1 million barrels a day. So we're seeing oil demand growth around 50% stronger than normal levels. Indeed, if I look at the 5-year average growth rate of oil demand over the last 5 years is growing at its strongest rate since 2006-07, which was the height of the commodity supercycle. So every day at the moment, as I pick up a newspaper and I open a newspaper, I hear stories about peak oil demand, the growth of electric cars, improving vehicle efficiency. But despite that, oil demand is growing at its fastest rate since the peak of the commodity supercycle. All those factors are real, they're happening, but what's pushing in the opposite direction is the impact of low prices. Throughout this period of time, as you know better than I, oil prices have been persistently low, and one message we should draw from the oil demand data in recent years is that oil demand remains very sensitive to the price movements, and that low price has stimulated this exceptional growth in oil demand. As you can see from this chart, much of the growth in oil demand is coming from net oil importers, so countries who are net importers of oil, benefiting from the windfall of low oil prices, allowing their economies to grow and their demand for oil to increase. Oil exporters, such as Russia, shown here in red, were obviously were adversely affected by this low oil price, and we see growth in oil demand in those economies weaker than normal. This looks at the composition of oil demand by region or by country. If I look at it in terms of product, shown in this chart, there are some signs that the impact from low oil prices may be starting to wane. Gasoline demand, shown here in green, we tend to think about as the most price-sensitive component of oil demand. And as you see, that was growing exceptionally strongly in 2015 and 2016, but that slowed quite a bit in 2017, indicating that perhaps the impact from lower prices may be starting to ease off. In contrast, the big driver of oil demand in 2017 was diesel and other middle distillates. And we know the nature of diesel and other middle distillates is less price sensitive, but tends to be more sensitive to developments in the economy, particularly in industrial activity. So as GDP picked up and industrial production around the world picked up, we saw this big, strong growth in diesel and other middle distillates. So if you like, the baton of growth shifting away from low prices into industrial activity. That's oil demand, but I must say, I think from an analysis point of view, oil demand's a bit boring. Every year for the last few years, we've had strong growth in oil demand. The real excitement is on the supply side. That's where the action is. That's where the big uncertainties are. And that's where the big uncertainties were last year, where you saw two big forces pushing the oil supply in different directions. On the one hand were the production cuts led by OPEC and Russia, the so-called OPEC plus production cuts, or sometimes called the Vienna Group, pulling down on production. And on the other side, US tight oil continuing to grow rapidly, pulling up on production. So this next chart is designed to try and think about those two opposing forces. The yellow line here shows the cut in production of the OPEC Plus or Vienna group. And this is relative to their levels in October 2016, which is how the agreement was framed. Now, you'll remember that the OPEC Plus group committed to reduce oil production by about 1.8 million barrels relative to that October 2016 level. And as you can see from this chart, they pretty much achieved that reduction by the beginning of the year and maintained those levels through the first 6 months of 2017. So they achieved relatively quickly those cuts and maintained them around stable levels through the first half of the year. You then saw this further lurch down in production cuts in the second half of last year into the spring of this year. So cuts went far further. That wasn't voluntary cuts, but largely that further step down was almost entirely driven by cuts in Venezuelan production, as the economic and political crisis in Venezuela caused production to fall off, with Venezuelan production falling by 700,000 or 800,000 barrels a day over this sort of period from the middle of last year through to the spring of this year. And as you can see, over the recent few months, post the OPEC meeting in June, which committed to getting compliance levels back up to 100% rather than a significantly greater, those production cuts have eased somewhat and are now close back to that 1.8 level that was the OPEC Plus's agreement. So this was a big force pulling down on production levels. Working in the opposite direction was US tight oil. Over this same period, from October 2016 through to the spring of this year, US tight oil, including NGLs, grew by about 2 million barrels a day. This is astonishing growth. This pace of growth is faster than seen during the height of the shale revolution in 2013 and 2014, despite prices being significantly lower. Some people I speak to when we're thinking about the recent environment and the high level of prices have said, well, tight oil didn't really respond like we thought it was going to. I have no idea what data they're looking at or what they expected. Over an 18-month period, US tight oil grew by almost 2 million barrels a day. That's astonishing growth. And so I think another message you should take away from last year's data is the US shale revolution is alive and well and continues to thrive, and these data point this out. This blue line then just takes the net of those two, just to give us a sense of the sort of the size of those opposing forces. And you can see that the net impact of the production cuts was gradually reduced over time as we saw this strong growth in US tight oil. So the production cuts start to help to support prices, and those high prices then bring on that stronger growth in US tight oil. But even if the blue line goes positive, remember, net supply here is still weak. And so perhaps the third big message to take from the oil data is the production cuts did work. The net growth of supply last year was very weak. Combined with strong growth in oil demand, allowed the oil market to adjust. And you can see that chart here, where the green line here shows a different level of inventories, OECD inventories falling pretty much throughout 2017, coming back down into line with normal levels of inventories. Now, there is no precise way of measuring normal level of inventories. I've included 2 or 3 different measures here, and they give slightly different readings. But the big picture and the big picture message to take from this is the OPEC Plus production cuts worked. The production targets were achieved and indeed exceeded during 2017, and as a result of which inventory levels fell from those very elevated levels that I had spoken to you about when I'd come here, I think, in both 2016 and 2017, and had come back down to more normal levels. So I think by the time that the OPEC and the OPEC Plus group met in June of this year, essentially this job had been completed and had been successfully completed. And people's focus was changing and focus onto something else. So over much of the past 18 months, much of the oil market's focus had been, will OPEC cut production? Will those cuts work? Will they be offset by tight oil? We found by the time we got to the summer this year, the answer was clear. They had worked. And the focus now was focusing on how big will the cuts in Venezuela production be? How big will the cuts in Iranian production be? And what could that do in terms of oil prices? And that's what you can see in terms of the price movements over this period. So again, during the first half of 2017, oil prices continued to drift lower because it took a while as inventories stayed persistently high. But as those production cuts came through and started to bite, inventories started to fall, we saw prices drifting up, reaching about $65 by the end of 2017 and continuing to rise since then, and today standing at a level between $75 and $80 or so. And I think the main focus and the main concern of oil markets now is just the size of the potential supply disruptions we may see through, particularly in terms of Iranian production and also Venezuelan production, and whether there's enough collective spare capacity in the oil market to be able to offset those supply disruptions and help to stabilise the market. And I think that's why prices are so high at the moment. And we can come on perhaps in the question and answer session to discuss some of those issues a little more. That was all I was going to say on oil markets. I think natural gas markets were equally intriguing last year. In particular, 2017 was a bumper year for natural gas, with both consumption and production of natural gas growing at their strongest rates for around 10 years or so. If you look on the right-hand side of this chart, you can see much of the increase in production come from increasing gas production here in Russia. Some of that growth in gas production here in Russia in last year was meeting increasing domestic and export demand in 2017, but some of it also reflected the strong growth in gas demand that had been seen in 2016. Much that strong growth in gas demand in 2016 had led to a running down in the levels of gas inventories here in Russia, and so some of that increase in production last year was designed to, or went into building inventory levels back up to more normal levels. On the demand side, on the left-hand side of this chart, the dominant source of this supply growth was China, shown here in blue. Chinese gas consumption increased by around 15% last year, accounting for around a third of the growth in global gas demand. The key factor driving this growth in gas demand last year were a set of environmental air quality targets, local air pollution targets, 5-year targets which had been introduced in 2013. Fast forward 4 years to 2017, it became increasingly clear that these targets were not going to be achieved without a very significant policy intervention by the Chinese authorities. And as a result of which, by around the spring of 2017, a whole series of policy measures were introduced to encourage both households and industry to switch out of coal into cleaner fuels, particularly natural gas. So this is not to do with the power sector. This was focused on households and industrial use of coal. The scale of this programme is immense. Over 3 million households had their switch from coal boilers to gas boilers in a 6 or 7 month period. This is, for somebody from the UK, this is a mind-boggling number. Even more dramatic was the growth was a switch in industrial demand away from coal into gas. Huge, far, far greater than that seen in residential. And this increasing demand for gas was compounded by the fact that this switch reached a peak just as the winter heating demand increased, leading to a further upward spike in gas demand. The result of this surge in gas demand was that was a severe tensions within the Chinese gas energy system. This next chart shows two particular features of this tension, but I could have shown you 20 other charts, all pointing to a similar story. The chart on the left here shows this big spike up in wholesale and retail gas prices in China in around the winter as people were scrabbling around trying to find gas. The chart on the right I particularly like because the fact the grey bars are above that blue line in December and January of last year are indicative of LNG imports being greater than the maximum receiving limits of LNG receiving limits. So this is indicative of a system being driven right at the brink of its capacity limits as China tried to get the gas it needed to meet all the demand. Despite all this, there was widespread rationing of gas, particularly in the industrial sector, as priority was given to households for winter heating. I can only imagine how frustrating it must have been to be a manager of a factory in one of these affected provinces. Earlier in the year, you are given very strong encouragement to switch away from coal into natural gas. And then a few months later, you're then told you have to close down for 2 or 3 months because there's no gas to power your factory. Now, some of these tensions reflect sort of just short-term problems which can be solved. Some of the pipeline flows, particularly from Turkmenistan, didn't flow as people had expected. You can build more LNG receiving capacity relatively easily. So some of these issues can be ironed out. But the more fundamental is these problems reflected some of the deficiencies within the structure of the Chinese energy system. The network of pipelines for distribution within China are very incomplete. So some of these high prices were driven by the fact that we saw LNG having to be transported by road over many hundreds of kilometres. Some local prices had LNG trading at over $20 an MMBTU at the height of this crisis. So really high prices as gas had to be trucked. Even more importantly, perhaps the single biggest problem here is a lack of storage capacity for gas in China. The seasonal fluctuations you see in any Northern Hemisphere country means that you need to have quite big storage capacity to be able to meet the big rise you see in heating demand during the winter period. In Europe and the US, storage capacity is around 15 to 20% of annual consumption. In China, it's 3%. Now, China has a program to try to build up storage capacity, but you don't go from 3% to 20% over a few years. So the message I take from what happened in China last year is gas demand is likely to carry on growing, but this big surge we saw in gas demand last year is unlikely to be repeated until these infrastructure problems have been solved. And it will take several years or many years for these infrastructure problems to be solved. It's hard to push much more gas into the energy system, particularly in the residential and industrial sector, until these underlying structural problems have been addressed. The other big factor affecting gas markets last year was LNG. LNG grew by another very strong amount last year. We saw growth of over 10% in LNG supplies last year, so another increase of 10% growth. This is a market which is growing very rapidly. That's the fastest growth we've seen since around 2010. As you can see, on the supply side, that growth was driven by Australia, in particular by Australia and US, as a number of LNG trains were completed and came on stream. On the demand side, you can see this strong growth in the Chinese gas surge led to a massive growth of Chinese LNG imports. China accounted for almost a half of all of the increase of LNG imports in 2017, with China overtaking Korea as the world's second largest importer of LNG, second only to Japan. This increasing impact, or these increasing developments in LNG, are having a big impact on global gas markets. One particular feature of that is what's happening in Europe, and the competition in Europe between pipeline gas on the one side and LNG on the other. For those of you with very good memories, you may recall that I showed you a chart similar to this last year, I believe. The size of these bars show the increase of of gas imports going into Europe. And what we saw, particularly due to the decline in gas production within Europe, particularly that in the Netherlands, that gas imports into Europe increased very significantly in both 2016 and, you can see here, in 2017. What was striking, and what I focused on the last time we were looking at this chart, was, well, look what happened in 2016. European gas imports increased very dramatically, but nearly all of that was met by increased pipeline imports, very largely from Russia, shown here in purple, but also from other pipelines, and the predominant one there was from Algeria going into Spain, with the growth in LNG only relatively minor. So let's move on a year with another 10% of LNG supplies desperately trying to find a home. What happened last year? And you can see in 2017 the picture was more balanced, with LNG accounting for around half of the increase in European imports, and pipeline only accounting for around half. Again, Russia increasing Russian pipeline exports to Europe, taking the majority of that pipeline flows, but now far more balanced between the two. Looking ahead over the next couple of years, we expect to see further really quite significant increases in LNG supplies over the next couple of years. So the market is likely to remain quite soft, with a lot of LNG supplies looking for a home. And so I expect Europe to remain a very competitive marketplace, and it will be interesting to see how much of this year's increase in European imports goes to LNG supplies rather than to pipelines. I haven't seen those data yet, but I think that's an interesting feature. The other reason I think I have talked at perhaps too much length in this room in the past about the reason why I think LNG is so incredibly important for gas markets is because it's changing the fundamental nature of global gas markets. In the past, in the sort of gas markets that I learnt about when I was growing up, the dominant form of trade in the past was via pipelines. Pipeline gas is going from one country into another. A key feature of pipeline gas is it's not mobile. If there's a shock in some other part of the world where demand goes up very strongly and prices go up very strongly, I can't do anything about it. I can't pick my pipeline up and put it somewhere else. And so I just carry on supplying gas to the country I'm supplying to. That market doesn't move and doesn't change, and prices over here can shoot right up. LNG changes that fundamentally, because now LNG can be stuck on a vessel. If it's going over to one country and suddenly prices over here shoot up, there's a huge arbitrage opportunity to tell that vessel to turn around and go to this side of the room. BP has a small army of traders who do that each and every day. They just sit at their screens, they look where vessels are going and look for arbitrage opportunities to move them elsewhere. So what should this do over time? The nature of this should change the dynamics over time and mean prices around the world become far more correlated with each other. Before, they were segmented, but now these vessels can move to make sure that these prices become more correlated. What's interesting, this isn't just some weird economic theory. You can see this in the data. This is actually happening. The chart here looks at the correlations between spot prices in Asia, Europe, and the US. You can see with the first wave of LNG, as the first wave of LNG vessels came on around the turn of the decade, correlation between European and Asian spot prices was really quite high. It's around 0.8%, so already high levels of correlation. But what's striking is, within a year or two of US LNG coming on stream, you're now seeing increasing correlations between US gas prices and those in both Asia and Europe. You can see that already with just the first few LNG trains from the US coming on stream. Over the next few years, we expect to see significant more US exports increase, and so these correlations are likely to get higher and higher. Another feature of this breaking down of these markets and this greater integration means if I have a shock in this side of the world, before, that wouldn't affect this market at all for the reasons I said. Now, if I have a shock in this side of the world, it will be transferred to this world as well, because the LNG will mean these markets are all integrated. So I'd expect the volatility of markets to become increasingly similar and converge over time. Guess what? That's exactly what is happening in the data. This chart just looks at the price volatility of those three spot markets, and you can see this strong convergence in their volatility. So this isn't just some abstract economic theory. This is real. It's happening in real time, and you can see it in the data very rapidly. This is changing the fundamental nature of global gas markets, leading to far greater integration and far greater competition, with competition between different suppliers of LNG, and in some markets, particularly in Europe, increasing competition between pipeline and LNG exports. Russia is, as everybody will know by far better than I, is the world's largest exporter of natural gas. So you are affected more by this than anywhere else, and it's just indicative of the changing nature of the market in which you are operating in. And again, I'm very happy to hear counter views and alternative perspectives when we get to the Q&A on that. A little bit more, so a few minutes on coal, which, if you like, was the backward step, one of the backward steps we saw last year with coal consumption increasing. In terms of what led to the increase in coal consumption, this is shown here on the chart on the left. The vast majority of the increase in coal consumption came from India, shown in that light blue chart bar there, which reflected increasing consumption both inside and outside of the power sector. You also saw a small rise in Chinese coal consumption, showing that slight blue line here, following these three big falls we've seen in Chinese coal consumption in 2014, 15 and 16. Now at this point you may be scratching your head. You may be thinking, I'm sure Spencer just told me there was a massive switch away from coal in China into gas in the industrial sector and the residential sector. How come overall coal consumption rose? And you're right, there was a big switch away from natural gas in those two sectors. This overall rise was driven by the power sector. Power sector demand grew rapidly in China last year. Renewables continued to grow, but not by enough. Hydropower in China, just as here in Russia, was very weak due to weak rainfall. And coal was just sucked into the power sector because it's the balancing fuel for the power sector in China. So I don't think this reflects some fundamental change in behaviour in China. It just reflects the dynamics or the cyclical properties of what was going on in terms of both power consumption in China and some of the growth in the other fuels. On the supply side, well, who was producing the coal to enable this growth? You can see the biggest drivers of coal consumption was the US in green and China in blue. In the US, this didn't reflect an increase in US coal consumption. This is not some amazing miracle that the US administration has achieved to revive the fortunes of coal in America. Rather, this is US coal producers producing more and exporting to the rest of the world, particularly to Asia. Now, I'll say this slowly because it's a little bit counterintuitive. The increase in Chinese coal production we saw last year, I think, is part of a policy of China to reduce the scale of excess capacity within their coal system. So at first blush this seems odd. How can increasing production be consistent with reducing the scale of excess capacity? And the intuition is because as China tries to reduce the level of excess capacity within its coal sector, it's having to try to manage a balancing act. If prices are too high, that reduces the incentive for coal mines to slow and to close. And it also means energy prices in China are very high, which is bad for growth. So too high prices are bad. But if prices are too low, that threatens the long-term viability of the coal sector, which still provides 60% of China's energy and is heavily indebted to the Chinese energy system. So too low prices could cause problems for both energy supplies and the financial system. So China is managing this process. It doesn't want it too high, and it doesn't want prices too low. To help manage that balancing process, it introduced last year, the beginning of last year, an explicit target band for prices, shown by the green hash line here in the middle. The blue line, the blue either side, are what the Chinese authorities call areas in which they will have increasingly focused on prices. So they're becoming increasingly worried if they're in the blue lines. And the red lines are my interpretation of exactly that. They're China's red lines for coal prices. If prices move beyond the red lines, they intervene to try and bring prices back into the band. What we saw during 2017 was coal prices being outside of the band, above the band, for much of the period. And so the Chinese authorities took a whole series of steps designed to increase coal production in order to get prices down back into the band. And that increasing coal production that we saw in 2017 doesn't reflect some fundamental shift for China back into coal, but rather its attempt to try to manage this balancing act to try to not get prices too high or too low, and is trying to make them sure they're within the band. So I think that is what's going on in terms of coal. And I think the big issue for those of you interested in the coal sector is how long will prices remain around this level? Will this price band shift over time? Our expectation, based on conversations we had, is prices are likely to remain, or the price band is likely to remain around this level for the foreseeable future. But some of you may have different views on that. Okay, I want to spend my last few minutes talking about the power sector before I wrap up. The power sector really matters. The power sector is by far and away the biggest consumer of energy. It absorbed around 40% of primary energy in 2017. It is also at the leading edge of the energy transition. It's where renewables impact the energy system. It's where improvements in energy efficiency can first be seen. So what happens in the power sector really matters. In terms of demand, power sector demand grew by almost 3%, shown here on the left, in 2018. That's pretty much in line with its 10-year average. What is striking about this chart is almost all of this growth in power demand came from the developing world, shown here in light green, which accounted for well over 90% of the growth in power demand. Power demand within the developed world hardly grew, and indeed has hardly grown for the last 10 years. Let me just show you a chart. I'm going to quickly flick because I think this chart's so cool. This chart shows you power demand within the OECD. As you can see, there used to be a very strong correlation between economic growth and power demand within the OECD. That's completely broken down in the last 10 years. Many people may tell you that the world is electrifying. Indeed, I think the world is electrifying. But it's worth remembering that when people tell you the world is electrifying, power demand within the developed world has not grown for the last 10 years. We can have a discussion about the factors which may account for this breakdown. The punchline for me is, it's a puzzle. I thought of 1,000 different reasons which may explain it, none of which seem to be true. So all of the growth in power demand coming from the developing world. Let me see if I can find my way back to where I wanted to be. On the supply side, this growth in power demand was met largely by a combination of renewable energy and also coal, shown in black. In terms of renewable energy, wind power continues to be the dominant source of renewable power and the largest source of growth for renewable power. But it was solar energy which made all the waves last year. Solar capacity, shown here on the left, increased by nearly 100 gigawatts last year. Solar capacity in China, shown in blue, increased by over 50 gigawatts. For those of you who sort of have trouble thinking about, well, what does that mean? Even if we take account of the relatively low load factors of solar energy, that 50 gigawatts in China is equivalent to 7 or 8 standard-sized nuclear power stations opening in 1 year in one country in solar energy. This is quite astonishing growth in solar energy. And as you can see on the right here, power generation from solar energy increased by 1/3 last year. This is astonishing growth. Some of this, much of this reflecting the increasing competitiveness of solar energy around the world, but also supported and driven by significant policy support. And one of the most sort of important developments I think we have seen this year is I think it was June of this year, China announced that it was phasing out its subsidies for solar energy, but far more quickly and more sharply than people had expected. So when I come back to this room in a year's time and we put this chart up again, my guess is 2018 may be the first year where the solar capacity hasn't grown, or the increase in solar capacity is not greater than the previous year. I expect to see a slight step down this year because of the support from China, which is the dominant level of support, is less as the subsidy program has been phased out. When you produce the statistical review, you look at literally hundreds and hundreds of different charts, different ways of thinking about data. I think the most striking and worrying chart in the whole of this year's statistical review is this next chart I'm going to show you, which looks at the fuel mix going into the global power sector. It's striking because despite all this enormous efforts around the world to move away from coal and the enormous efforts to grow renewable energy, the shares going in the global power system are almost unchanged over the last 20 years. The share of coal in the global power sector in 2017 was 38%. The share of coal in the global power sector 20 years ago, in 1998, was 38%, exactly unchanged. Non-fossil fuels, the share of non-fossil fuels in the power sector was actually lower in 2017 than in 1998. Yes, renewable energy has grown very rapidly, but not as rapidly as the share of nuclear power has declined, and so overall nuclear energy hasn't changed. Normally, when you have to stand up in front of 150 experts, you're looking for your most exciting chart you can find. If somebody comes with a chart which shows 3 straight lines, you say, that's not a very exciting chart. I think this is the most striking chart of 3 straight lines I've ever seen. Striking, but also worrying. It's worrying because we know the power sector is the sector where we need to make most progress if we're going to get on the road consistent with meeting the Paris climate goals. The power sector is by far the largest single source of carbon emissions from energy use. It accounted for over 1/3 of carbon emissions in 2017. It's also the sector which countless pieces of analysis by us, by the IEA, by the UN, by the MIT, would all tell you if you're going to make most progress, it's the power sector where you can make most progress because it's where fuels compete side by side. So it's the easiest point to where you can start to get shifts in the fuel mix. But it's a sector where we have made no progress over the last 20 years. So I think this is a wake-up call for everyone, really. It's a wake-up call for all of us who consume power, thinking about the way in which we consume the power and the form in which we consume it. It's a wake-up call for large energy producers like BP to make sure that we play our role in terms of producing low-carbon power to go into the power sector. But most of all, it's a wake-up call for governments around the world to say, well, what are you doing? Instead of focusing on lots of other types of policies which may sound more exciting for your citizens, you should be focusing your policy efforts at the power sector, which we know matters most and where we've made collectively no progress over the last 20 years. Just a quick final chart, a little bit happier note to end on. What does this same chart look like for Russia? So if you just have mentally pick that in your mind and let me show up the Russian one. Russia's is quite a lot better. First of all, the overall shares of the power mix here in Russia is obviously a far lower carbon energy system. Coal plays a far more significant role, natural gas and non-fossil fuels in the form of nuclear and hydro playing a lot bigger role. And although it's not huge, you can also see there has been a shift in the shares. Over the last 10 years, the share of coal has gradually drifted lower, and that's largely been taken up by growth of non-fossil fuels, which I think is a combination of growth of both. I think more nuclear than hydro, but a combination of both nuclear and hydro. So in some sense, the report card for the Russian power sector quite a lot better than that for the global power sector. Natalia, I'm conscious that I've talked for too long, so let me stop there and hand over to questions. My experience of coming to this room in the past means I don't need to say this, but I will say it nonetheless. The big value for me on sessions like this is for learning and for people to better understand some of these issues. So if I've said some things which don't seem quite right, if you think they're wrong, they may very well be wrong. So please feel free to challenge and point out the bits of analysis you don't think sound quite right. Thank you very much.